Cool. Yeah, hello everyone. You're welcome to today's section on drug use, culture, and religion. Sensible2021. They are going to be doing justice to the topic at hand. First, we have Mr. Adeolu Ogunrombi, who has over a decade experience in drug policy, human rights, and has mentored a lot of young people towards having a sensible society, including myself. Also, we have Isaac Adekola Olushola, who is a rock star and a young youth leader at the University of Calabar, SSDP chapter. They are going to be here joining me to see how we can reach a very good conclusion on this topic, and I'm sure we are going to have a very wonderful one. Mr. Adeolu Ogunrombi is a public health expert who has worked on a wide range of issues such as HIV and AIDS, sexual reproductive health, drug control response, and youth development. His leadership and work have gained several recognitions. He is a member of the West Africa Commission on Drugs, convened by the late Kofi Annan, and facilitated the formation of the West Africa Drug Policy Network, a coalition of over 300 CSOs, and was also the founding executive director of Youth Rights Nigeria. He served on the John Hopkins Lisset Commission on Drug Policy and Health, and on the expert reference group Amnesty International. He has also worked with multilateral agencies such as UNODC, UNICEF, and WHO. I'm going to also tell you that Mr. Adeolu Ogunrombi is also one of the founding board of directors of Students for Sensible Drug Policy NGO in Nigeria. He has been amazing, and I'm looking forward to his presentation today. Also, we have Isaac Olushola Ogunkola. He is an ambassador of the Royal Society of Medicine and Hygiene in the United Kingdom. An ambassador of tobacco of SSDP University of Calabar, Nigeria, began orientation training. He is an accomplished graphic designer and also recently won the International Network of People Who Use Drugs Global Poster Competition. He's also a student of the Student Award winner of the Antibiotic Guardian Shared Learning Award developed by Public Health England for his project on antimicrobial resistance. He is an early career researcher at the Global Health Focus Africa with a number of publications in reputable international peer-reviewed journals. Isaac is passionate about unifying harm reduction, public health, and human rights harmoniously. Permit me to call our first speaker, and he's going to be sharing this section, Ogunrombi, to speak to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moronfolu, for that general introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be able to join the SSDP conference this year and to be able to provide some insight into the debate and the topical issues that you have highlighted. I know this evening you asked me to talk on the issue on culture, religion, and their impact on drug policy reform, especially within the African setting. I've also told that this is going to be more of like a conversation, more of like a discussion rather than, a kind of a PowerPoint presentation meeting. So I'll be doing a lot of, trying to talk to the issue within the limited time that I've been given. So based on this, I've tried to rephrase the question in this way. Is culture and religion an inhibitor or promoter of drug policy reform in Africa. And this is actually an interesting subject, looking at the two keywords here, talking about culture, talking about religion, and we know how these two important subjects influence a lot of things in terms of policy, not just within the African setting, but also in many society globally. And so these are two things, two keywords that we cannot shy away from when we, talking about drug policy reform. So our attempt to provide my own perspective on the subject, whether the culture and religion can actually inhibit or promoters for drug policy reform within our context. First, let's look at drug use in Africa and also the setting of religion within the continent. We can speak to three dominant religions within the African setting, and that is Christianity, Islam, and traditional belief. Of course, there are other religions being practiced within the continent, but these are the three dominant religions. And available report has actually shown that over 90 to 95% of the population within the African context practice one form of religion. So we are talking about something close to 100% of people. Of course, not 100% per se, but over 95% of people within the continent practice one form of religion or the other. So we are, this is a topic that is well situated that we can speak to. And in terms of the population estimate in Africa, Africa currently has the second world largest population, and in terms of size, and also in terms of population is second only to Asia. And looking at the 2018 estimate, it's currently estimated about 1.3 billion people living in Africa. So that is huge. But when we look at the prevalence of drug use, even though we don't have a comprehensive report that gives us an holistic perspective of drug use within the region, but we can take, for example, some of the reports that have been highlighted in the World Drug Report by UNODC, the 2020 report that shows the prevalence of, picking the example of cannabis, which shows the prevalence of cannabis use in Africa is around 8.5%. And when you compare it to the cannabis prevalence use in Asia, which is just 3.1%, so this is over 2 times that in Asia. And even within Europe, it's about just 5.7%, the prevalence of cannabis use, and the global average sits around 5%. So you can see that the drug use prevalence within Africa is actually huge. And a report also estimated that by 2050, the number of drug users in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to increase by 150%. And even this 150% will represent an actual 5% increase from what it is currently, the current data. So this is looking at how, with the growing population and the number of people using drug, what we're going to be faced with by the year 2050. If you contrast this with from the same report, what the percentage increase will be in countries like Asia by 2050 is just going to be around 70% increase, but Africa is going to witness about 150% increase, within the same time frame. So we are looking at the realities. So all, this drug use is happening also within a religious context. Because if you look at a population of over 95% that are religious or practicing one form of religion, and with a huge percentage also using drug, we'll be able to highlight the fact that the expected effects that you ought to see maybe in a religious setting on drug use practices is not what we are seeing. So we need to face those realities. And it's also important to mention at this point in time also that this increase in the number of people using drug is, however, is still happening in the face of repressive drug policies, as most of the drug policies and laws in African settings are repressive with zero tolerance for drug use. So the laws, the policies assume people are not using drugs, but in the reality, drugs are being used and the prevalence is actually increasing. And with a population boom that is being expected within the African setting, we should expect to witness more, going forward. So we've not really seen, the contrast that ought to be seen in, say, a religious society and, drug use, considering the dominant theme around morality. Then when we move to the issue of culture, as culture is popularly defined as the way of life of a group of people, we have also come to understand how dynamic culture can be, especially its fluidity, which is affected by both internal and external influences. So we know there are traditions, there are cultural values, but these have also been changing over the years. It is interesting to know that some cultural changes that we are even witnessing within the African setting today were equally influenced by religion. So while we are talking about cultural practices, we can also see how religion influences even cultural practices as well. So in general, the cultural disposition within most African setting is more conservatism, let me put it that way. A situation whereby there's minimal expression and believe in traditional values, the status quo, and about things not really changing, and with high regard for what is considered socially acceptable. So I want us to take note of that. It's a culture that have a high regard to what is socially acceptable. For example, if we try to relate this conservatism to the promotion of human rights, you will realize that the promotion of human rights within the African setting is mostly viewed from the perspective of collectivism, togetherness, rather than a focus on individual rights, as we see in many Western society. So when you're talking about, human rights within the African setting, most of the times, the drafting, try to focus on what is considered a norm within the society. For example, the idea of my individual right to use drugs, as I am responsible for what I put in my body, will be considered highly unacceptable as a demand within the African communities, as it is believed that you are accountable to society even before you yourself. So we can see the influence of culture, the norms, and the perspectives on even what is written in laws and policies. Of course, this can easily be argued for in a Western society where there's more focus on individualism, and which is much more respected. So we can see the dynamics within, in terms of culture, how the norms and traditional values shape even laws and policy and the perspective, and how individuals can demand for their rights, and you can contrast this also maybe in a situation where, maybe polygamy also as a marriage. Within the African setting, there are certain laws that actually make it legal for a man to be polygamous. But when you look at in a society, traditionally that is frowned against, and the laws of the society also do not support such. So we can see the influence of culture and certain norms on how laws and policies are also shaped. So having said all that, if we also look at some traditional practices in time past when it comes to drug use in African setting, there are a lot of reports that have established and show that cannabis has been used for several decades throughout southern, northern, and eastern African countries for centuries. These have been used within traditional settings. It's only in West Africa region that there was no clearly documented usage prior to World War II, which ended in around 1945. So this, has been, like, the use of cannabis is documented to be used traditionally. But if you contrast that to what is happening today, you will see while some communities have held on to that practice, even though they have laws that make it illegal, but they still prioritize their, their traditional, values. The general society frowns at such practices. And we can also relate, the use of the plant among some traditional worshippers, religious group who have used it for rituals or for their worship as part of their practices. So time will not permit, but we can see a couple of literature on how this has happened within the African communities. So in many communities, this, like I earlier mentioned, this cultural use is still being maintained today despite the criminalization. So the traditional use of cannabis at some point was not considered an immoral behavior. It was a norm, but gradually things change. So we need to ask ourselves, then what changed? And this is part of the the dynamic nature of culture. The changing cultural landscape being influenced by a lot of things. Of course, religion also plays a role. And we can also speak about international regulations, the criminalization, the treaties that were set up, which many countries sign up to. These became like an infringement, some sort of infringement on traditional practices in some of these communities. So these were influenced. The cultural practices landscape change based on some of these influencing factors that I've highlighted. But while we focus, the focus of this conversation is on culture and religion, but we need to understand that the major promoter of the war on drugs has been external influence within the continent. While culture and religion has played, is playing their own role, more, the major and significant influence that we've seen over the years has been external influence. We cannot underestimate the influence of the American war on drugs on many African countries. Many development agreements in terms of like bilateral or multilateral agreements that some of the African countries sign up to in an attempt to support them in their drug control response, were actually wrapped or tied to the war on drugs. So, for instance, you have a Western country signing an agreement with an African government to support them in their drug control response. And when you look at the agreement within the drug control response, most of the priority interventions focuses on the criminal justice system. It's about like maybe the buying of weapons, the training of the judiciary, the building of prisons, and what have you, that doesn't really look at the other aspect, even when you're talking about the health system, treatment, rehabilitation, harm reduction, and other services. And that, in other words, they are trying to tell them, look, the priority here is to have a strong criminal justice response. And whatever that means, if it's by locking people up, it's about criminalization, that is what we want to see. We can also not forget, quickly, in a hurry, there were, some times ago where also the US used the decertification program to as a tool to make some African government embrace the war on drugs, because they feel, look, if you are not doing so much in preventing drug trafficking from your countries, we're going to decertify you. Then planes will not be able to fly from your country. Your people may not be able to fly to our country. We will reduce your aid and things like that. So these played a lot of influence. So while we are discussing culture and religion, we need not to take our eyes off the fact that a lot of things were also influenced by externally, in a way that we were not really, many government, African government did not really, were not really conscious of. But those things also were easily acceptable because it aligned with some cultural values which were already in place. So what has been the influence of culture and religion? So now that we're talking about culture and religion, what has been the influence? So I would like to discuss probably 4 key principles or commonalities central to both religion and culture, and see how this has impacted our drug control response, whether as inhibitors or whether as promoters, or how we can turn them around to ensure effective drug policy response. So the number one is both culture and religion dictates what is considered to be morally right. Then secondly, they set standards in society, what is socially acceptable, what is socially approved. And then in the third point is culture and religion promotes the principle of compassion and care. This is something we can see in our culture, in our religious teachings. The principles of compassion and care is also very central. And then the last point I will want to discuss in this regard is these also provide opportunities. The culture and religion provide opportunities for social and organization ties. So it provides some, form of platform for people to socialize and for people to get organized into blocks in society. So how has this played out in response to drug use, people who use drug, and drug policy reform? So take, for example, the first point, morality. So within our context, drug use is, within the context of religion and culture, drug use is considered to be immoral. For instance, in a country like Ghana, the local language used for cannabis is popularly referred to as the devil's tobacco. And you know what this means when you call the devil's tobacco. So that means it is something that is immoral, something you shouldn't even go near. And that is a strong tag. So that means anyone who uses cannabis is considered to be using the devil's tobacco. So he's playing with the devil. And such a person within the religious setting need to be, set apart or set aside, because he's kind of having fellowship with the devil. And then in terms of standard, the second point, religion and culture setting the standard for the society and for the community. This look at the principle of collectivism. So therefore, drug use is socially disapproved. So if we, in a collective way, we have agreed that this is a devil's tobacco, then we have socially disapproved it. So we have set a standard that for us as a group, that we want everybody to abide by. We have a disapproval for the use of drug. Then the third point in terms of compassion and care. Now, compassion and care is reserved for the desired. So there are people, is a sentence principle to culture and religion, compassion and care, but is considered to be given to those who deserve it. So in this case, I'm not sure drug users deserve this compassion and care. So when we are to view it, these people are to be excluded from the compassion and care that the society consider to give out. And that is why anytime the right of a drug user is violated, it is considered to be deserving. So if we are complaining, drug users are locked up, they are beaten. Many people, the response for society, or maybe a female drug user was raped, the first response we hear is, she deserved it. Why was she using drugs? So is such people are not considered. Yes.
I think we lost him for a bit there.
Okay. So can you hear me now? Can I move on?
Yes, you can go.
Okay, so the drug users are not considered to deserve the compassion. So that is then the last key principle in terms of social ties. For there to be a social tie, looking at the cultural and the religious tenets, this require some level of conformity for you to belong. So for you to belong to our group, you need to conform. For you to belong to maybe our cultural or religious group, there's need for a conformity. So a person with a non-conforming behavior will lose the privilege such structure could provide. So we can see how culture and religion can easily play out when it comes to drug use, people who use drug, and drug policy reform. So what are the implications of this? Like I've mentioned, in rounding up, the growing reality of culture and religion as the standard setter, of our society will definitely continue, and continue in our, within the African setting and even globally, being the as a group of people that set the standard. Such we continue, and such we make it difficult for drug use to be viewed as a norm in an African society. So if our concern or desire to see drug use to be viewed as a norm, then this will be a huge inhibitor, a huge barrier that needs to be faced for drug use to be considered as a norm. Then number two, I'm talking about the implications of some of the things I've explained earlier. Cultural and religious influence can actually serve as a protective factor in prevention of drug use. So looking at how culture and religion have situated, the standard and what should be considered as as a standard and morality. It has helped and we continue to serve as a protective factor, or can serve as a protective factor when you are considering prevention of drug use. And this has actually been established in many studies. You can go online and look at some scientific journals, and you see that has established religion and some cultural practices as a protective factor in prevention of initiation of drug use. So people who might be maybe more religious or spiritual abstain from the use of drug. So this has shown to kind of helpful in the prevention of drug use. Of course, we know the idea of predisposing and protective factors when we are talking about drug use prevention. So this, the society may continue to see as a positive thing to be held on, and why culture and religion need to keep influencing the norms within our society. Then the third implication is regarding drug use and drug dependence as a moral issue. Culture and religion looking at drug use and drug dependence as a moral issue exposes what I call the knowledge deficit in our society, and is a huge knowledge deficit because that means a lot of the traditional leaders or religious leaders and the society as a whole have little or no understanding on the many reasons why people use drugs. So if we keep regarding drug use as a moral issue, which religion and culture present to us, then it's the implication, it shows a huge knowledge deficit, because when we fully understand why people use drugs, then we know it's no longer a moral issue. But the current implication, present it as a moral issue. And because of that, it perpetuates stigma. And even the least attempt to talk about decriminalization of drug use, that is, stop considering people who use drugs as criminal, is generally considered like an endorsement for drug use. So when you're telling policymakers you don't need to treat people who use drugs as criminals, they come back to say, oh, if we relax such law, that means we are already endorsing, the use of drug. So considering drug use as a moral issue present this a huge negative effect that make influence stigma. So hence a need to rightly situate drug use as a public health issue. If we can ensure that people understand what a public health response is, then we know it's no longer a moral issue. For instance, if you look at the overdose death, the overdose crisis going on, in the US, even in Canada and some Western countries, you see that it's no longer a moral issue. It's a public health crisis that we need, to intervene in. So there's need to rightly situate this, and we can learn a lot from the HIV and AIDS response. At the beginning, the HIV and AIDS response was also having the narrative and morality. It's because people are promiscuous, it's because people are reckless, that's why they are contracting HIV, and not so much was being achieved. People were not coming out to test, people who need intervention were not receiving, and people were so reluctant to disclose the status. But when we started implementing a public health approach, it's not about morality again, it's not about judgment, it's about an intervention that works. It's about ensuring things are properly situated. Then countries started making progress. In fact, in the early days, for you to go for an HIV test, it is more of a moral judgment. So people refuse to test, people refuse to know their status. But when religious leaders and traditional leaders also mobilize to take away the covering, the veil, they were able to also speak to their congregation, to society, and say, look, this is not about judging people. This is about, this is an emergency that we all need to respond to. And things started changing. And today we have organizations that are even association of religious leaders against HIV and AIDS. So you have religious leaders that are even living with HIV, responding to HIV intervention. So we can learn a lot from the AIDS response. Then the fourth point in terms of the implication is the centrality of compassion and care in most culture and religion provide a strong base for drug policy reform. This is already there in many religious settings and teachings in terms of compassion and care and culture as well. The challenge so far has been that we don't think drug users deserve this compassion and care. So this is a huge opportunity. This is an opportunity for advocates to explore, so that the compassion and care that is required, even in terms of justice, that many of these religions teaches can actually be extended to people who use drug as well. But for this to happen, there's need to be a lot of education, enlightenment. And from my own experience, engaging with a couple of religious leaders from different faiths, I've come to realize that when they are properly educated on this subject, they are always ready and willing to extend the compassion and care and say, to people who use drugs, and not just, lock them up, beat them up. They don't deserve being in our community. They don't deserve being in our society. So there's a huge knowledge deficit, like I earlier mentioned, which we need to bridge the gap. So where this has been successfully done, these religious and traditional leaders provide a critical support for decriminalization. So you see them say, no, don't lock people up anymore. Even though they may not kind of advocate or support some extensive policy reform, but at least they would say, look, we need to provide treatment, we need to provide rehabilitation, we need to provide support, we need some level of intervention and not the usual punishment. And of course, we've seen how some religious houses also try, in the name of rehabilitation, try to lock people up, try to put people who use drugs in dehumanizing condition. But when they are properly cultured, when they are properly educated, we can see, the changes. So in conclusion, religion and culture have a lot of influence on drug control response globally and in African setting. We cannot shy away from this. This will continue to happen. But both can be an opportunity and also an inhibitor for progressive reform, depending on how we are able to utilize the space, depending on our engagement, depending on what we are able to do, and how we can get people to understand what we are trying to say. So I would like to stop here. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. And I'll be happy to respond to questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. That was mind-blowing and so entertaining, fantastic and incredible presentation. I don't want to take much of it. I would love us to go straight to Isaac Ogunkola to have the floor while we also go for the questions.
All right, thank you so much, Moronfolu.
You have the floor, Isaac.
All right, thank you so much, Moronfolu. It seems you keep pronouncing my wrongly. It's Ogunkola, Isaac Ogunkola. And I would like to appreciate Mr. Adeolu for his wonderful presentation. He actually captured what I intend to share here in a bigger picture. But still, I'll just quickly run through what I have here. I'll be sharing my slide in a few minutes, and then I'll just go through it in about 10 minutes, then we can take in questions together. Okay, I'm trying to look if I can share my slide. All right. Can you all see my slide?
Sure. It's visible. Lovely.
Okay. So, based on the topic we've been given, drug use, culture, and religion. So, I'll be coming from an African perspective to this and how I actually understand this topic in my own way and how I've been able to relate this particular topic to the members of Students for Sensible Drug Policy in University of Calabar. So here we have a question. What shapes an African child? What shapes an African child? The first thing that comes to mind when you talk about an African child or what shapes the perception or behavior of an African child is culture. And like we all know, culture is what's way of life, the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people and society. So in the African community, we have a certain idea, we have a certain customs, we have certain social behavior that is peculiar to us. And another thing that shapes an African child is religion. They believe in a supernatural being that governs the universe. And so Africa as a continent in whole and its people are usually shaped by their values, their culture, and then their religion. In addition to this, a typical African child born and brought up in the continent grows and develops within the cultural heritage of his people. He observes and imitates the action of the elders in that community and that of his siblings. He watches the naming ceremony, like if there is a social event like a naming ceremony, he watches how it is being performed, the religious services, marriage and traditional rituals. And all these processes are the elements that shapes the thinking, their character, the attitude, and sometimes the intuition of this African child to like events. And what does our culture and religion says about drug use? What does the African culture, what does the African religion say about drug use? Like I stated, this may be a shocking revelation, but the truth is that the African culture and the religion have some certain elements, which includes morals, love, values, virtues, and the likes. But our culture and religion, the African culture and the religion says nothing about the drug use. If you have a proof to actually prove me wrong, you can come up and let's discuss on this. No African culture or no African religion have a particular law, a policy against the use of drug. And so you may begin to wonder, where do our drug policy come from in Africa? Where do the drug policy in Africa come from? I think the image here should give us a glimpse or an idea of where the policies in Africa come from. Now, we need to understand that the policies on drug use in Africa, they are entirely informed by the Western models. And if you are to look at the war on drugs, it is an important strategy from the Western world. And why is it imported into Africa? Because it is clearly known that the civil society organizations, they are weakest in Africa. If you are to make a comparison between the European countries and African countries, if you are to look at the civil society organization that works around drug policy reform, you will know that it is actually, we have the weakest in Africa. And so it has been the colonial government that brings this policy in have the understanding of this situation, that civil society organizations in Africa are the weakest, and so war on drug can easily penetrate the African continent. And if you are to look at the establishment of some drug law enforcement agencies in African countries, for example, the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency in Nigeria, it clearly shows that it is an imported lock, stock, and barrel. And this tactics of war on drugs utilizes four elements of culture and religion. If you are to look at this core element, it is one of the things mentioned by Mr. Adeolu, moral. What is moral about drug war? The war on drug. That was one of the things that Carol mentioned during her presentation. Is there anything moral about the war on drugs? And this is the actual core element being used to penetrate culture, to penetrate our religion. And it seems this policy, these laws, this drug policy, these drug laws are coming from our culture. It seems they are coming from our religion because of what? The tactics used by the government has been able to utilize some core element of our culture and religion. And if you are to believe with me, drug policy is never an African thing. You can quote me anywhere. Drug policy is never an African thing. It is imported lock, stock, and barrel into the continent. And what is the way forward? Actually, this is my winning design for the International Drug Users Day in 2020. And from here, you can see some of the write-up I have on the poster. What is the way forward? What is the solution to the war on drugs in Africa? What is the solution to criminalization of people who use drugs in Africa? It is simple and clear. It is in clear terms, like solution, decriminalization, solidarity, support. These are the way forward to the situation on ground. And if you are to look at this, it's revolve around a particular element. And the element is actually common to our religion, and it is common to our culture as well. And what is this element? If you are to look at drug use, culture, and religion, there's an intersection. And then we can understand with me from what I've discussed earlier that if you are to solve human behavioral problem with policy, there will be a lot of limitations, severe limitation. Researches done in Africa has proved this, that no policy can actually have a total controlling power or contain human behavior. And the element that actually binds drug use, culture, and religion is love. And if you are to look at it clearly, Mr. Adeolu do mention of some core components of religion and culture, and one of it was compassion. We can actually relate compassion to love. And from this element comes harm reduction and public health, because harm reduction is coming from the perspective of people who use drugs. Harm reduction is coming from is going to meet them where they are, and it's portray love and compassion towards the community of these people. And I would like to state it clear that Africa is a land of love. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isaac, and that was wonderful. I love the pictures, I love the graphics, I love the insight, I love how you were able to merge your presentation with the reality in Africa. I also like to applaud the presentation of Mr. Adeolu because I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure this one has really taught our audience a lot about the African drug policy context. And I'm sure a lot of our audience would have also known that the drug policy is not an African thing. We have said this over and over again, and I'm glad that Isaac and Mr. Adeolu have been able to justify why this is not our thing. And we'll be taking few questions, though I have some questions myself, but I would like to take the questions from the audience. So allow us be in the realm where everybody are seeing ourselves physically. That is really important. We shouldn't just make it a question, but where we can have that contact. And the first question says, what can Africa, specifically Ghana and Nigeria, do to change the religious perspective of drug use, and what measures can be put in place to eradicate and curb stigmatization of drug users in those religious settings? So, Mr. Adeolu, I hope you had that, sir.
Yes, I saw that question, and yeah, that's a good question. I think the basic thing that we all need to do is creating more awareness, providing critical understanding to both traditional and religious leaders to understand some of the predisposing factors or the many reasons why people use drugs. And also understanding from the religious perspective the key issue around compassion and care. And like from the Christian perspective, we could see that from the life of Jesus a couple of times when he had people, when even the society has seen some people as sinners, but he reached out to them and considered them to be important people. In fact, he said that they are the reasons why he came. So this is very important. Education. When people understand, I was also having a conversation with someone today about the linkages between even childhood trauma and substance use. Childhood trauma, even such as child molestation, sexual assault, rape, and substance use. And the only thing people see on the surface is the substance use, but oftentimes don't understand where the person is coming from. Of course, there are people who use drugs just for recreational purposes alone. But when we have an elaborate understanding on the reasons behind what people, why people do what they do, then I think we will have more compassion and care and response. So it's all about reducing stigma is through education, enlightening people on what drug use is, and even as simple as the fact that not everyone who uses drug is dependent, or using the word addicted, that is commonly used to drug, it will go a long way to change disposition perspective. So not say, because somebody uses it, it's already, the tag, the stigma tag addict. So it's about educating people.
Thank you very much, sir. And this takes me to the next question. It says, Isaac, do you think we can change drug laws without cultural, religious beliefs changing, or must those change first before we can engage in policy change?
Okay. All right. Personally, I think it is 100% possible to change drug policy from the angle of culture and then religion. And how can we do that? That is a big question. If you have to look at religion, and as Mr. Adeolu has said earlier, from the life of from the Christian perspective to harm reduction, I actually have made a presentation on that Christian perspective to harm reduction. If you are to look at the core elements we've mentioned earlier, like love is common to culture, love is common to religion. These are the elements we can use to create awareness about drug policy reform. If we can come from this angle, we need to connect a dot. We need to connect a dot between what people know and what they don't know. And what do they know? They know culture. They know religion. And what is it they don't know? They don't know harm reduction. So we need to come from a perception of what they know to what they don't know. And how can we relate these two together? If we can connect these dots, we'll be able to change drug policy in Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Isaac. That was so explanatory and insightful. Yeah, Mr. Adeolu, this question would really, I'll be glad for you to help us pick it up because from your years of experience, and I know you've worked with people who use drugs, people who inject drugs. And I remembered some 7 years ago, I was opportune to undergo training in the office space in Abuja. This question says, HIV prevention among people who inject drugs is so critical all across Africa. When talking to decision makers or the general public, do you find there's more support for harm reduction when evidence can be shown that interventions such as syringe exchange programs are proven to reduce new HIV infections?
Yeah, that's very true. Um, HIV infections um, related to injection drug practices is a huge one that we don't talk about often, and partly due to the fact that we have limited data. A couple of people who inject drug are considered, they are not out to reach because the service providers or policymakers have decided not to reach out to them, or they made them to be hard to reach. So I won't say they are hard to reach, but it's the policy environment that has made them to be hard to reach. So no enough data to really show the magnitude of the challenge. I remember even when I started talking about this issue within the Nigerian context, um, uh, even I had people from the policy makers, authorities saying, look, such people don't even exist in Nigeria. And I said, look, they do. And we are having substantial infection coming from this group of people. And good enough, there was a report on the mode of HIV transmission that was developed for the country. And it showed that the 9% of annual new HIV infection in Nigeria is being contributed by people who inject drugs. So, but the challenge about the concept of harm reduction with lawmakers is that they only have an understanding of, the use of drug and no drug use. So when you come in contact with someone, talk about, oh, this person uses drug, the next thing they want to hear is, stop using drug. But harm reduction makes us to understand that even if you have a goal of no drug use, the journey between the use of drug and no drug, between use of drug and no drug use is a journey. And within that journey, a lot of harms can actually happen to the individual, and not just to the individual, and even the society where the individual lives. And for people who inject drugs, we can choose to ensure that they don't inject with unsterilized needles. We can choose to ensure that they are not contracting HIV or transmitting it among their cohort. So in that case, we need them to understand the import of the public health challenge in terms of communicable diseases among this group of people. So it's about us explaining this issue, making them to understand that this is a necessary intervention. This is something that needs to be done while you are looking at the other hand. At this point in time, we need to look at the individual. Even if the individual chooses not to stop the drug use, can we ensure that they are free and safe from harm? That should be the priority.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we have exhausted our time, but I will seek the indulgence of all our participants to just take these two questions that out of the many that I have to ask our panelists. So I'll take the first one, and I'll please want us to make it short, sharp, and precise. The first question, Isaac, is there a common ground between religion and the end of the drug war in Nigeria? What can you say about that?
Yes, definitely. There is a common ground between religion.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Isaac. And Mr. Adeolu, sir, do you think religious leaders in Nigeria are open to a dialogue around drugs that isn't explicitly focused on abstinence?
Yeah, for religious leaders, I would say I've been opportune to be in a couple of trainings with some of them, and from different faiths. And I tell you, based on the training we had, they are open because they realize, in fact, interestingly, some of them, as a family member or somebody close to them, who have this experience. So when you have it, when you have such situation relatable, when you can relate to such situation, will you say you want your child or you want your family members locked up somewhere? So of course it was tough at some point. I won't say it's going to be the same with everyone, but them having an understanding of even what drug use is, drug dependence is, it's it, it's eye opening. So we don't. I won't expect a change overnight, but it's going to be a gradual process, a gradual engagement. But I would say they are open, but there will be resistance. But it's a gradual process. When we keep engaging, when you are able to provide the information that is required, I think things can change because they all have a role to play.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I hope this session has been able to help us draw similarities between incarceration, compassion, and love. And I'm very glad our speakers, Mr. Adeolu Ogunrombi and Isaac. And if you have questions moving forward, feel free to probably get you the desired answer you like to hear. Thank you so much for joining this